lecture in New York City Winter Lecture Series. So a few housekeeping items, as you just saw. We are recording this Zoom, but don't worry, your screens are not, the attendees, your screens are not on and your mics are off. So just those that you see speaking will be recorded. Throughout the lecture, you can submit questions to the Q&A, which is probably at the bottom of your Zoom. And we'll answer those questions at the end as time allows. We're also turning on closed caption for the Zoom, and we'll be sharing a recording of the Zoom with everyone who registered later this week. For those of you that are new to New York City Audubon, we are a grassroots conservation nonprofit that works to protect the city's wild birds and their habitats through research science, advocacy, education, and outreach. One of the education programs is this Winter Lecture Series, which is with 5 monthly lectures on a variety of topics related to urban birding and conservation. A big thank you to Claude and Lucienne Bloch, whose generous support of the series has made tonight possible. Now, tonight we have a really exciting evening planned with landscape ecologist Dr. Eric Sanderson. Dr. Sanderson is a senior conservation scientist at the Wildlife Conservation Society with over 100 scientific publications to his name. His publications cover landscape ecology topics ranging from New York City's greeners to jaguar habitat. His work has been featured in the New York Times, National Geographic, The New Yorker, and many others. Importantly, it is consistently used by scientists on the ground, whether they're aiming to predict flooding risk in New York City, or like we do at New York City Audubon, setting targets for habitat restoration to conserve wild birds. Dr. Sanderson is also the author of 3 books, including the national bestseller Mannahatta, A Natural History of New York City, which I must admit was always within arm's reach as inspiration when I was working on my own dissertation. But tonight, we're here to talk about his newest project in his 4th book, Welikia. And I'm so excited for tonight's discussion. It's going to be an absolute pleasure. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Eric Sanderson. Eric?
Great. Thank you so much, Dustin. That was a very generous introduction. And thanks, everybody, for joining tonight. So like Dustin said, I'm going to talk to you about our work on the historical ecology of New York City over the last 25 years or so, and give you a little bit of the sense of how it's evolved from the initial work we did on what Manhattan Island was like, what Mannahatta was like 400 years ago, to expanding this work over the rest of the city, to how it's helping us think about what the future of New York City will look like. And we'll have a lot of time at the end for Q&A. This is just sort of a buffet table, sort of tasting table of delights about the historical ecology of New York City, and I really look forward to all of your questions at the end. So just to begin with, so we all know what this place is. This is New York City, circa about 2008, right before the book Mannahatta: A Natural History of New York City came out. And the goal of the Mannahatta Project was not to take away the city or undo the city, but actually to help us learn something new about this landscape, about New York City, by doing an imaginative trip back in time to imagine what this same landscape looked like 400 years ago, and in a specific moment in time, not as a way of trying to give extra credence to that moment, but to realize that, every history book in New York City starts with this little boat over here in the Hudson River. That's Henry Hudson's ship, the Half Moon, which came into New York Harbor around September 12, 1609. And what if we could just wind back the clock a few hours before then? What will we have found if you or I or Dustin, were walking around on Manhattan Island 400 years ago? What would we have seen? And we would have seen an island like this that was 25% smaller than the island that we know today, even though the sea level was a couple of feet lower than it is now. We would have found an island with 54 or 55 different ecosystem types. We would have found all kinds of wildlife, whales and dolphins in the harbor, and 350 species of birds, and over 1,500 species of plants. And we would have found people living here. There have been people living in the New York City region for 8,000 years, as indicated by the smoke arising from the Collect Pond in lower Manhattan. It took thousands of years, arguably millions of years, to create the landscape that was there that day when Henry Hudson sailed into New York Harbor. If you fast forward a little bit in time, we don't really remember the city that came after Hudson. Hudson came in 1609, and then in 1624, the Dutch came to settle. And then in 1664, a warship came over, a British warship, and took over and changed the name of the city to remember this man. This is James, the Duke of York. And I say this because we in modern times here in 2023, we talk a lot about colonization and decolonization, and I think there's a very important sort of assessment going on about the founding of the United States and where it comes from. And I think we often don't realize how deeply that colonization is just touches sort of everything about our lives, including the word New York. New York refers to the city of York in northern England, and it was what the brother of the king was called, the Duke of York. And James's brother, Charles II of England, literally gave his brother a letter and said, "You here, James, Duke of York, I give you all the land between the Delaware River and the Connecticut River and New England and Maine to take under your domain." And he, sailed a warship over, and then he just took it by force, basically. It turns out the Dutch weren't very well prepared. And this is such an important part of the way we think about this landscape, because we've adopted ideas from the 17th century about property, about rights, about the relationships of different people, especially indigenous people, that come from this guy's mind. He never came to New York, and yet whenever we say we're a New Yorker, or Dustin says I work at New York City Audubon, or I go to the New York Public Library, in some sense we're giving tribute to this guy. And I just think we need to think in a bigger way about this place that we live. We need to sort of lift the curtain, like that curtain behind James, and try and understand what was here before that. And that's an important part of this process called decolonization. So I'm going to talk to you about three things tonight, really emphasize the first two, which is the sort of madness with maps that underlies this project and trying to reconstruct not just what Manhattan was like, but all of the city. And then talk to you a little bit about my current book project, the Welikia Atlas, and then talk to you a little bit about how this helps us envision the future. So I think probably many of the people online are aware that New York City has a tremendous history of maps, and terrific cartographic history. And what we do in this process is we take these old maps, like this map from 1844 by Hassler, which is part of the U.S. Coastal Survey, and we georeference them to the city so that we can lay the modern streets of the city on top of the maps. And then we start digitizing features on the map. We digitize the forests, and we digitize the wetlands. We digitize the bathymetry under the water, as well as the topography over the water. We pay a lot of attention to the shoreline and how the cartographer mapped the shoreline in a particular time. Is it the low tide mark? Is it the high tide mark? Is it the mean tide? And the year that it was mapped in? Because of course, sea level rise has been rising ever since the glaciation of this part of the world 20,000 years ago. And so it's really important to know kind of where you are in time. And then we can then adjust the shoreline back to what it was in 1609 using these really very interesting shoreline reconstructions that coastal scientists have made. And then we do this for lots of the city. When we worked on Mannahatta, we just had sort of one map, the British headquarters map, that told us mostly what we needed. But for the Welikia Project, it's really been hundreds of maps drawn from the 18th century, from the late 18th century through the 19th century, even into the early 20th century. And my colleagues, of which there have been very, very many over a very long period of time, so I've had lots of help along the way, sort of laboriously digitize these line by line, point by point, into databases that go into the computer. And then that allows us to then synthesize the maps to actually kind of put it all together. And there's a lot of work in that. And actually, there's been a lot more work in that than I kind of anticipated when we started doing the rest of the city. Because not every map is made for its own purpose, and they don't always show the same feature the same way. And if you had 2 or 3 versions of a stream, well, you got to eventually say, okay, well, I think this is probably the one that's most right. And then how does the stream fit with topography, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, this map here shows our digital elevation model. So a map of the topography above sea level, which is in the kind of oranges and red colors, and then the bathymetry below sea level, which is in the light blue colors, as of sort of 1609. And New York City, as we know it today, of the 5 boroughs, has this kind of odd triangular shape. So we've actually extended the work out kind of in a 30-mile round, 30 kilometers round the mouth of Gowanus Creek, which captures all of New York City and then adjacent parts of New Jersey and Westchester and a little bit of Long Island, just to make the maps more pleasing. Of course, it's completely arbitrary where you stop drawing the map, but we focus on the city because the city's mattered so much to people that there's such a great cartographic record for us to be able to do this work. And then, on top of the topography, and I'll come back and talk about this more in a minute, we digitize in the streams and the wetlands and the springs and all the salt marshes and freshwater marshes. And we've also done a lot of work to try and understand where the Lenape were living in the contact period. So right around 1609, from historical sources and archaeological sources, and then trying to piece together a trail network based on past reconstructions of those trail networks, and then, knowing something about the topography and the vegetation. We have a whole variety of databases that my colleague Kim Fisher helped us construct that, my students and I have been filling over the years of these spatial data resources, which are maps, but also texts, also books, sometimes images. We, keep track of them because it's taken so long. It's in so many people, you need to put the map someplace, and then, someplace else a year later, somebody might georeference it, and then might be a year after that, somebody else digitizes it. So we have this mechanism to be able to track everything and then keep track of the bibliographic information using Zotero, which, if you don't know, is a free online bibliographic package, which is really great. And actually, if you Google Zotero Welikia, you can see all of our references there. We've also kept track of place names, and in the beginning, this was just trying to coordinate between maps, but it's actually become a much more important part of the process in the kind of Welikia phase of things. Because the great thing about a name is if you have a name, you can trace it back through text, and then sometimes you can find descriptions that predate the maps, or predate the sort of higher quality maps that we can digitize, and then that information then could be used to feed in to reconstruct the ecosystems and reconstruct the features. It's also just completely fascinating to see how these places have changed. In some places, we have the Lenape name for a stream or a hill or a shoreline place, and then we have a Dutch name, and then later on we'll have a British name or an English name, or sometimes multiple English names. And this part of the work has required lots of digging back through old local histories. New Yorkers have loved this landscape for a long time, and they've loved to tell their story. And so they tell it in all kinds of different ways. So we read back through all those old histories and try and, glean out these little tiny snippets of text that describe the stream or the hill, which are often kind of to the side of the main point of the authors, whatever they're writing about. But, for me is kind of the main point. And then we connect these back together. So we put the names with the features on the map, like this map from the South Bronx showing the mouth of the Bronx River. We also use images. And again, this has become, I think, a little bit more important in the Welikia phase of things. New York City has just a tremendous history of landscape paintings and photography once cameras were developed. And because the city sort of developed first in Manhattan and then sort of with distance away from the city, there's lots of parts of Queens and Brooklyn and parts of Staten Island that we actually have photography for. And if a feature like Glover's Rock in the bottom left is within a New York City park, you can still go and visit these things and take their photograph. Like I took that picture a couple of years ago in Pelham Bay Park. We also developed this process that I describe in my book of taking the list of all the plants and animals and their dependencies on each other, and then being able to reconstruct their distributions using something we call muir webs. And we have another database all about this. I won't bore you with the details, but this is how we create these network diagrams that show how all the plants and animals, including people, but all the living things connected to each other and to the abiotic elements of the landscape, the soils and the waters and the precipitation, the soil moisture, and so forth. And you get these really densely packed network diagrams that show how everything's connected. And each of these, I know this looks more like an art project than a scientific document, but actually each of those gray lines represents a habitat connection that's documented in our database that connects, the little dot that's at the end of the line to some other little dot that's somewhere else in the figure. And then there are these techniques that kind of computer scientists have developed to take these and iterate over them to generate these richly complex network diagrams. And I just love them so much because I think this is kind of at some level the right way to be thinking about our world and to realize that like human beings, all of humanity in this representation, the Lenape people that were living in New York City is in one of those dots. And, of course, there's all kinds of connections within that dot, between all the people and the people that lived at the time. And then, when the Europeans came, that changed their relationships. But then all of that stuff, all those things, all that rich complexity that we love about being human is only possible because it's part of this larger network of relationships. And of course, for all the bird lovers on the call, some of those are birds too, just to say. So this is just an example from the area south of Newtown Creek and Williamsburg and Brooklyn of how we do. We take do this for any part of the city, but you take an aerial photo. We've reconstructed the bedrock geology, so these different colors represent the geological boundaries around the East River, which turns out to be really interesting. And then the bedrock geology has been most recently modified by the superficial geology that was left by the glaciers when the Wisconsin Glacier retreated 20,000 years ago or so. So patterns of stratified drift and glacial till. And then, from those two things and the topography, we can derive the soils and then the soil properties associated with those. I've, shown you the topography. You can see here, just zoomed in. And of course, the topography is so important in a coastal environment for the pattern of flooding and salinity gradients that then really drive the pattern of the coastal ecosystems. And of course, within that is the hydrology. So Newtown Creek or Best Patches is the Lenape name, and the Bushwick Inlet. And then the wetlands around those. And then all of the ecological communities. And actually, this is something we're still struggling with, which is how to illustrate it, because, of course, as we take a larger area, there are potentially more ecological communities. And on our current list, we have about 200 different ecological communities in the water, in the marine environment, and on land. And so much so that it's, you can't really put 200 colors on the map and have it make sense to anybody. So this is the way we do it. You show where the low salt marsh is, or the maritime forest, or the coastal oak hickory forest, which, historically would have been full of chestnut trees 400 years ago. And then, of course, on top of that, the Muir web gives you the distributions of individual species. So the clustered flower bluet, which is a kind of salt marsh edge species. And, here we draw on, the botanical sources of the city. Like John Torrey, who's a very important early American botanist, hung around in New York, wrote his first book about New York City, actually. And he said that, you find this in moist and usually shady places on the borders of a swamp about a mile from Brooklyn and Long Island. So that's what he wrote. To kind of figure out, where might the clustered flower bluet actually have been? Or smooth cordgrass. This is a little easier. This is our high salt marsh special or low salt marsh specialist. Or the Eskimo curlew for a bird, formerly observed in Mermation, seen occasionally in the hundreds in fields on Long Island. The fute or the doughbird, and so forth and so on. Also, the ecosystems. I'm a ecosystem and landscape ecologist, so I love to think about all the different kinds of habitats that nature provides. and love to go and visit these places, many of which we can still see either in the city or in areas adjacent to the city because of conservation efforts over the last couple hundred years. We also, I've been working with my colleagues Eric Mell and Jesse Moy on reconstructions of what the landscape looked like. This is one we did for the New York Times a couple of years ago during COVID, which is meant to be a reconstruction of what it would look like if you were standing in center field in Yankee Stadium and looking toward home plate, if you can imagine. Yeah. There was a big stream that came down into a big tidal wetland where Yankee Stadium is. And that the trees you see in the kind of distance, the middle distance there, that's actually Manhattan Island. That's Washington Heights. Oops, sorry, go back. So just some numbers. These are a little bit out of date. They're actually from 2 years ago, so I need to update these. But really hundreds of maps, thousands of place names. We're actually up to 3,400 place names as of over the weekend. Of which there's multiple names often for the same place. So 3,400 places, that's part of what I'm writing about. And, thousands and thousands of descriptions quoted, many, many documents, maps referenced. And just to say, there was a lot of streams, a lot of shoreline here. It was actually a very kind of aquatic environment, which is what attracted the Dutch here. In addition to the sort of deep waters offshore and its kind of protected position. These are the kinds of things that made it a good place for people to live for such a long time. And needless to say, it's, I guess it's 3 years to take. Just entering my 24th year of working on this. And really appreciate all the help I've had over the years to make this possible. So let me just pop out of here and just to say, this is what it looks like in a sort of the GIS kind of context. Where we can zoom in and sort of see the details kind of anywhere in the city, and then turn layers on just as I've been showing you before, like that. And I'll just what I'm doing for the Welikia Atlas is I'm writing about place names. So these red and blue dots, these are all the place names. These are all the individual places that I'm writing about. And the blue ones are all the ones I have in draft, and all the red ones are the ones I still have to do. So I'm about halfway through. I've done most of the Bronx and about half of Manhattan and all of Jamaica Bay. And actually over the holidays, I was working on Bay Ridge and through Greenwood Cemetery, and I need to finish up the rest of Brooklyn anyway, and so forth and so on. And these are names of hills and streams, islands, shoreline, oyster beds, channels in the water, Lenape sites, Lenape trails, just kind of everything you want to know about the places. And each one, I feel like each one of these is just like each one of us. It has its sort of own individual story over time, and that's a little bit what I'm trying to tell by writing the entries, the gazetteer entries, which I will explain to you more in a minute. So let me just go back here. So okay. So I'm working on this Welikia Atlas. That's the working title of the book. I don't know what the eventual title will be. And I'll just want to say a few words about how it contrasts with my previous book, Mannahatta, which I think is a really nice book. But Mannahatta is sort of constructed as this sort of, as one of the reviewers called it, an ecological detective tale, where I'm sort of trying to figure out over time what the landscape was like, and I sort of invite you as the reader along that process. And I just realized that was not going to work at the same time because there are just way too many stories to tell, and and they jump through time, and so it'd be too much to try and do this in the same structure, the same kind of narrative structure. So the other thing is that Mannahatta is a very beautifully illustrated book. Markley Boyer was the illustrator. He did a really fantastic job, really wonderful job. But in some sense, the image is so beautiful that no one ever reads the words, which kind of kills you as an author. So, so one of the things I want to do is maybe give you a book that where the words are just as important as the pictures and the maps. And speaking of the maps, I love Mannahatta, but because of the sort of constraints of the size of the book, the maps are just too small. You just can't really see as much as you want to see. And so, and even though we have a website where you could, go into a block and get a list of all the plants and animals that used to live on that block, and that's terrific. And by the way, we're trying to raise the money now at WCS to make it possible to expand the same work, the same treatment over the rest of the city, because we have all the data to fill out all the rest of the blocks of the city. But it's important to know, like, how does a book relate to a website? In this sort of modern communications time, you got to think about how all the pieces sort of fit together. What can you do well on the web, and what can you do well in a book? And so what we came down to is to make an atlas and a gazetteer. And the atlas part is, basically taking up the extent of the city and making these plates, these 35 or so. Sorry, I think it's more than that. I think it's like 45 plates. I'll show you a couple of these that are in draft form. They look like this, and the idea is to kind of do a sort of USGS style treatment of the landscape of 1609. So to show you where the forests are, the different kinds of wetlands, but to show you the bathymetry, and kind of these are like the kind of maps you would take hiking with you, and they'll be at 1 to 24,000 scale. They'll be published in a book that Abrams has very kindly agreed to do, that would be big enough for you actually to see the details. And then, to put them in sort of juxtaposition with each other, both with maybe some renderings of the landscape of the past, but also with some modern maps of the city, so that you can actually figure out where a particular stream or hill or soil is in the context of the city that we all know today. And then accompany that with a gazetteer, which is like a place name dictionary, where I would write about the individual features and tell their story in their own terms. So say something about their geological and ecological origins, and then describe the way that they were used by people and by wildlife. And then to very kind of briefly summarize, as briefly as I can, because there's 3,400 of them, 3,500 of them to do, what happened to them. What happened to them over time. And then accompany that with, pictures and images, maybe, little details out of the maps, modern photography, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, some of these will be longer and some of these will be shorter, but also to, I don't know if you noticed this, but to actually lay in the reference materials, because, well, just frankly, it's been just so much work doing this. It would just kill me if somebody else started having to, they wanted to know about Turtle Pond and Alley Pond Park, and they didn't just start with the things that I already know about. So to actually give the reference details so that people can go and find it themselves. And I'm sure there's more to be found about all these things, but at least give people that sort of I don't know, those breadcrumbs into the forest to let them find their way further in. And there really are just so many names. And they're just, the names themselves are just kind of wonderful, and just sort of beg the question about where did they come from, and who were they, and who were these people, and what were they doing, and what lived there, and so forth and so on. And it's fun to sort of, take each one of these and try and think about not just what it says like in the history book, but what does it say in the natural history book, and how does that affect the history book, if you like. Because we tell ourselves this story about New York, that it's all about the people. This person did that, and this person did this, and they did that, and they were awful to these people, and those people did this, and whatever. But in fact, nature created the foundations for everything, just everything, and spent a lot of work at it for a really long period of time. And it just seems important to remember that. And I think, past generations of New Yorkers did remember it. I think it's kind of a late 20th century, early 21st century affectation to think that these things don't matter, or they're not part of the history of the city, because they are. And so in this way, to do such a detailed reconstruction of the landscape, that it creates this idea in your mind, just won't go away. That's so compelling, like this image from Mannahatta down by the collect pond, and you see the smoke rising from the Lenape sites, and you can see the fields that they created to the forest. But then to know that there's like 7 kinds of forest, and 5 kinds of wetlands, and that there was a beach over here, and that all these different kinds of plants and animals lived here, and that it was really just tremendously productive and abundant and fascinating and interesting. And it looks like this today, which is also like so interesting and so fascinating, but in a sort of different sense. And I really think that the future of New York City is going to rely on us appreciating not just the city as it is today, but the landscape that allowed the city to become the city that we love so much. Like I said at the beginning, not to take away the buildings, but to take lessons out of the city as a forest and then build it into our idea and the structure and our lives in the city going forward, so that the city can last as long as the forest did. That's to realize that in some very deeply fundamental way that cities are habitat for people, but the habitat for people isn't more important than the habitat for all the other critters. And if we are going to displace some plant or animal or take away some kind of bird habitat, we have some sort of obligation to replace that, either by modifying the way we live or by picking someplace else outside the city where we make a difference. That the city is that there are many kinds of New Yorkers, if you like. And even though this like red-tailed hawk probably would take offense at being called New York is in the sense of the Duke of New York, they're still trying to find their living here. And at some level, they're still expecting it to be trees again and wetlands, which is the kind of habitat they need. So I think I'll pull out here, but just to say that, as much as my work is about the past, for me, it really is all about the future, a future that, the skeptical, the intrepid, and the imaginative, and the tree can all embrace as the future of New York. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. That was really excellent. I want to remind everyone, as you have questions as they come up, please drop them in the chat. We're going to be going, in the Q&A, not in the chat. We'll be going through and asking a few. We have a few coming in. But that was really great, Eric. And it seems like it was, I can't even imagine how much work that all was to go through and look through all these old historic documents, which sounds like a lot of fun, but also like an incredible effort. So congratulations to you and all of your colleagues that have worked in this.
Thank you. I think, frankly, I can't imagine it either, because if I tried to imagine it all, I would just lie down and stop.
Yeah, it must have been so much.
Yeah.
So some of the questions that are coming in, I guess one of the first things that came up is, how can we help? We have a lot of people that are very interested in this work and really want to help, but how can the public or all of us here take your information and do something with it? How can we help both the project and moving the city forward?
Well, I mean, it's your thing, Dustin. So, I encourage everybody to support New York City Audubon. But if you ever want to give a little bit of money to help us create these websites to get the information out, we'd love to have that. But I think maybe more importantly is to, the first thing everybody does with these websites and these materials is they go and look at their place, and then they think about what it means for them, for their house, for their business, for their school. And so, so do that, like take it to heart. That, we all love the green areas, the natural areas in New York City, but in fact, everywhere in New York City used to be a natural area in some sense. And there used to be a, highly compatible way of living in this environment for thousands of years. And so, I think all of us, both as, individuals, but also as, groups and as a city as a whole, we need to look forward to that. And I think we're going to have, unfortunately, nature is coming to force our hand a little bit because of climate change, right? Like, the atmosphere of this, the atmosphere, we've changed it so much. We've like doubled the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere, right? just imagine if you set out as that as your goal. I want to double the atmospheric concentration of CO2. Like, it would take you so long. And in fact, it took hundreds of years to make it happen. And that is such a fundamental factor in the ecology of our world and the ecology of our city in particular, our coastal city, that is going to have big changes. And I think the only way we get out of the 21st century is by taking nature's lessons to heart. And that means not, that means changing the way we live here, right? We're going to have to give up some land to the water to make it happen so that people are safe. And that's going to create opportunities for nature that we haven't had before in the city. And I think those are super valuable, and habitat for other critters too. So I think there's that. And then I think this, at some sort of kind of meta level, this idea about network structures is really important. I don't know about you, but I come away with this work kind of wanting to like hug my family and see my friends, because I think that those network relationships that we have, they, at some level, that is what we have. That is our world. And it's important to do that for your family and your friends, but also to do that to the landscape, to the natural world, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's really amazing. And so it sounds almost like when you walk out into the city and you're traveling the city, you see the city as it used to be, and then as it can be in the near future, and kind of recreating and going about considering all the change that we had. And I see we have a question too about how has the climate changed since 1609? You mentioned the amount of gases we put in the air. What exactly has changed if you were here in 1609? I mean, how did it feel?
Yeah. Well, there are definitely parts of New York City that I know better 400 years ago than I know today. For sure. Even when I'm in Brooklyn, I always have to think, where am I relative to the terminal moraine? Am I going up the terminal moraine or down the terminal moraine? Am I like on the coastal plain? I live in the Bronx, so I don't get to that part of the city very often. And so I know the maps a lot better than I know the actual configuration of the streets. But yeah, how have they changed since 1609? Well, one, the sea level has risen about a foot a century over the last 400 years in New York City, and at an accelerating rate in the 20th century and in the 21st century, of course. So that's one thing, is the sea level rise. So sea level has come up about over a meter and some portion. So, and that's what we're struggling with about the 21st century, is another meter of sea level rise, right? So that's one thing that's happened. Also, there's a really nice paper that talks about how, as we've engineered the edges of the land, we've actually increased the tidal range, because the water, it used to be like the waves would come and then they would hit a beach, or they would come into a salt marsh, right? And that would sort of soften the waves, and then there was less coming back out. But it turns out that you can run these, and this is all a little bit beyond me, but you can run these oceanographic models, and they actually showed that the tidal range is higher now. So even on a regular day, the tidal range is higher because we've bulkheaded and rigidified the shoreline all the way around. Huh. Also relatively warmer. It was not uncommon to have ice flows in the Hudson River. During the American Revolution, the harbor froze so hard that the American revolutionaries were able to bring cannon from Staten Island over the ice with oxen back to the tip of Manhattan, and they placed it at the southern tip, and that's why we call it the Battery, right? It's the battery of cannon that were there at the Battery. And so, and even when I first came to New York in the late 1990s, occasionally, I live on City Island, and occasionally you would see ice flows in the wintertime around City Island, but I haven't seen that in a couple of years now. Oh. So, the winters were colder, and that's important for a couple of reasons. It's important to be in a 4-season climate because it makes all your migratory birds dust and fly away, right? But also, it makes all the keeps the insect populations down, right? They have to deal with it. It has a lot of knock-on consequences. And then, of course, it's also getting hotter and more humid, right, in the summertime, and it's changing the relationship between temperature and light that insects and plants have with each other, and that's throwing a lot of things out of whack. And there's hundreds of studies now that show this species is trying to be here at this point to expect this species, and that species not there, and what's going to happen. And I personally think nature is a lot more resilient that we often give it credit for. But we need to give it space to be resilient in and to work these things out for itself. And New York City, because of its place on the migratory pathways for birds and things, is such an important place for that to happen, which is exactly why the New York City Audubon work is so important.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and with the resiliency and the connections, I mean, those mirror webs that you showed in the early on in the presentation, that was so powerful to see that and see how many connections there were, and how if we can give a little space to nature, it can really come back in a lot of ways. I have a question about the meaning of Welikia. Where does the word come from, and what exactly does it mean?
Yep, that's an excellent question. So it's a borrowed word. It's a greeting word from Lenape, and it means, and I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it right, so I apologize for any Lenape speakers out there. But it means, it's what you would say to somebody who comes over to your log house or to your wigwam. It's like a greeting word. You'd say, "Welikia, welcome to my good home." And I borrowed that because, in sort of 2010, 2011, we were thinking, okay, well, let's expand this historical ecology work over the rest of the city so it covers the other, 6.4 million people that don't live in Manhattan, right? That seemed like a good idea. But what were we going to call it, And, the Lenape had no name for the 5 boroughs in New York City, right? We didn't have the 5 boroughs in New York City until the 1890s. So why would they have a name for that geography? And they don't. I just don't. So, and I didn't want to call it like Mannahatta 2 or something, right? Because that seemed kind of insulting if you live in the Bronx or Brooklyn or something. And it's also true that there are Lenape names for, parts of things that we would recognize as Long Island, Western Long Island, or the Bronx, or Staten Island, but none of those made it into English, right? Bronx is named after the Swedish guy that happened to set up, on the river that's named after him. Queens is named after actually the king, Queen Anne, who was the queen consort of King Charles. Brooklyn is named after, a little town in the Netherlands. And Staten Island is named after the Estat General, the sort of governing body in the Netherlands. So all those are called colonial names. They're all European names. Right. So, anyway, so I was like, there's something called the Lenape Talking Dictionary, which is a really great thing that one of the Lenape tribes in Oklahoma did. And I was just flipping through it, trying to pick a word, and Welikia seemed like the right idea. Because it really is a good home. This is a really good place to live for people and for all kinds of other critters. And so that seemed like an appropriate name for what we're trying to do.
Right. And another question about the Lenape, which links up with the question that I had as well, is how are you able to identify the Lenape sites that existed over 400 years ago when they have now been developed? And personally, when I was looking at the map that you displayed with the sites marked on Staten Island and then lacking Manhattan, I thought it was interesting that there seemed to be more people on Staten Island than Manhattan. And at what point did that flip? Or do you think that there are sites on Manhattan, the current Manhattan, that you missed?
Well, there are surely sites all over the city that we don't know about. So the main sources we have for that are one, colonial accounts. So if you read back in the old Dutch records, and in the sort of historical records, because there was a big war in 1642 between the Lenape and the Dutch. It was really a really terrible thing, started by the Dutch. This guy Van Kief's War, it's called sometimes, or Kief's War, and it lasted for 20 years. And so there's a lot of records from that period of time. And then the Dutch were very particular about trying to get land deeds from the Lenape. So they would, take these to these illiterate people. And I don't mean illiterate as in not smart. I just mean that they didn't have a written language. They had a really rich oral culture, but they would take them these documents. And they would say, okay, I want you to make your mark on this thing, and I'll give you a couple pots or guns or, whatever. And they took that in their understanding to be property rights. And in fact, all of our property rights in New York City come from those documents, which are, none of which would stand up in court law today.
Right. Yeah.
If you went to I don't know, somewhere, to some uncontacted tribe in Brazil, and you try to get them to sign something, it's just not right. But in fact, every property right that all of us, anybody who owns property in New York City, including the city itself, derives from those documents. That is the original source. Wow. Anyway, so we have those. So we have those. And then, people have found things over time. So you have, just random stuff that's in the archaeological literature. And starting around the second half of the 19th century into the early 20th century, there was kind of big push of interest in where were the people who lived here, assuming that they were all gone, which also was not always the case. And there were several kind of amateur archaeologists. Robert Bolton is probably the most famous of them. Alison Skinner. Anyway, a bunch of other people. They wrote a bunch of things. There's another kind of cluster of amateur archaeologists in the generation after. There was a man named Ralph Selecki, who actually became a very prominent archaeologist at Columbia University, found an important Neanderthal site in Iraq and Mesopotamia in the 50s. But he started out, he grew up in Queens, and he and his friends would like follow the Robert Moses bulldozers as they were bulldozing the Belt Parkway, and they would cut through like a Lenape shellman, and then they would go like that weekend and try to excavate it as fast as they could.
Wow.
And Selecki wrote a couple of papers back then, and then a couple papers late in his life. So we've got all that stuff. And then finally, after the Landmarks Preservation Commission was established in the 60s, that required actual archaeological surveys. And so now there's a whole sort of bureaucratic mechanism that, has a whole series of levels of archaeological survey, depending on where you're found. There's a couple of professional archaeologists that work in the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And there are all these reports that have been written. They're in kind of the gray literature by archaeological consultants all over the city. Wow. and every one of them kind of summarizes like the history of that part of the city. So they're a little bit tedious to go through because there's a lot of repetition. You're like, okay, yeah, I know about that. Yeah, I know about that. But then you find this little detail that this guy or this woman had that this person didn't have. And you're like, aha, gotcha.
Wow.
And then, the advantage that we have relative to a lot of those people is we have all these other, documents about the landscape. So, they talk about, well, I found this knife blade or this, arrowhead or this point, in this place. And then, well, I know about the stream and I know how close it is to the shore. And, I know about maybe where the trail was. And so, we often can place things a little bit more finely than they can. It's all sort of synthetic reconstruction. And like I say, we, track all the references so that if we don't get it right, somebody else on the call someday can fix it for us.
Along those lines too, I guess currently, how have you interfaced or contributed to local displaced Native communities and with this new work?
Yeah, I talk to them as often as I can. It's a little bit, it's a little bit hard. I don't know if you can tell, I'm not a Lenape guy. From California, Heinz 57 American kind of European sort of background. But the Lenape community, it's not one community. Like, they've had this long diaspora that really started back from the 1630s and has continued to this very day. And so there's 4 federally recognized tribes in the United States. There's 2 recognized tribes in Canada. There's a couple others kind of state or locally recognized tribes. And then there's a bunch of people that live in not recognized groups of various kinds and sorts. So not everybody gets along with each other, unfortunately, just like not every Irish person gets along with every other Irish person. But I've been very fortunate to have been invited on a number of occasions to speak to various configurations, a group of Lenape and share the results I have. And putting them on the website, writing them in books, trying to make all this information available to people is I think, trying to serve that purpose for them.
Yeah. Wow, that's excellent. Now I have a couple of questions about the animals and a question for the kind of the birders in the room. But could you go over what animals and what lived in the area, what kinds of animals lived in the area around 1609, any surprising things? And then also I'm curious, looking back, around 1609, where would have been the best birding spot in the city?
Oh, dear. Well, Dustin, you might have to help me with that second one. So, I think what surprised me most is the amount of big wildlife that was here. I mean, I say that as somebody who works at the Wildlife Conservation Society, but, there were mountain lions roaming around, wolves all over the place, black bear, a number of different kinds of whales and porpoises and dolphins in the harbor. When I was researching the fish fauna with John Waldman, one of the things I learned is, like when we think of the terrestrial environment, we're aware of seasonal changes, like, this time of year, there's no leaves on the tree, and, later on there'll be leaves again. And, a lot of the terrestrial critters, they have to adapt to these changes in temperature. But the fish, I mean, like the harbor in the winter is a completely different environment than the harbor in the summer, right?
Right.
Like the salinity is different, the temperature is different. In some sense, the currents are different because, the amount of flow coming out of the Hudson River is different. The meteorology is different, right? Because we get, hurricanes and extratropical storms, during a certain time of year. And so the fish fauna almost completely flips. I mean, there are some resident fish, but, like you see fish that are associated with Florida in the harbor, in the summer, in the late summer and early fall. And in the wintertime, it's more like fish you would see in Connecticut or up in New England or in Maine. And they kind of come and go like this. It's like if you took a forest, I don't know. It's like if you took a forest from New England and then you switched it out with a forest from Florida, and then you swapped it back again a half a year later with the forest from New England. It's like that big of a change. And then, all those things I showed you in the mirror web, all those things have to adjust, right, to all those changes that are happening. Right. So it's a super dynamic environment. And I mostly think about things up here on land, with us. And so I that's something that's been very surprising to me to learn more about. It's also, it's interesting to think about where the Lenape were getting their food from. I don't know if you saw when I very quickly showed you the Lenape one is, but most of the sites are along the edge of the water. Right. Why is that? And it's because of shellfish, because of the oysters and the clams. And the main thing about shellfish is that they're there all the time. Even in January, if you're willing to take the polar bear plunge, you can go get yourself an oyster, a clam, right?
Right.
And whereas almost all your other food sources are seasonal, like the amazing fish runs in the springtime, or the migratory birds coming through, especially the shorebirds. Those are coming through in certain seasons, or the nuts or the berries. They also, grew their own food. They had, they grew the Three Sisters garden of corn, beans, and squash that was invented down in Mexico and traded up this way. But there's some debate about this, but a lot of archaeologists think that, at least in the coastal New York region, it was really wild foods that were so abundant that allowed people to persist. And the horticultural foods were mostly about having stuff you could store over the wintertime to bide you through, like in January and February, when maybe you don't want to go swimming to get the oyster, but it's still there. So I think that kind of thing is super interesting to think about, about how people adapt. And there's a number of archaeological sites around the city where they've found all kinds of materials from different wild foods. Which reminds me that if there's a very small number, like between 5 and 10 archaic sites in the city. So these are 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. So a long time ago. And those sites have a pretty different composition of the food in them. Sturgeon plates, and elk. Yeah, and elk bone in these sites, which is, again, quite different than even what you would expect here in 1609. Yeah.
And do you think that was mainly due to the changing the climate over that time period?
Changing climate and associated changes in the vegetation. Yeah. And, it's pretty, it's possible anyway that when people first came here 8,000 years ago, that there were still things like mastodon running around, right? That and there's a number of sites where mastodon fossil remains have been found, in New York City. So we know they were here in the in the post-glacial period, like 10,000 years ago. Also, like Pleistocene horses and things have been found in New York City fossils. So
wow,
yeah.
Well, we've talked a lot about change, but what is the least changed area in New York City that you would say? Where could we go get a glimpse of the area as it was in the past?
Wow, that's another tricky question. Well, places I'll tell you the places I go. I don't know if Well, one place that I love to go is the Thane Family Forest in the New York Botanical Garden, which is as you well know, Dustin, an uncut forest along this amazing Bronx River gorge with the river running through it. It's just like even 25 years later, it still astounds me that place exists in New York City. So, and it's so, it's just so beautiful, especially if you have a chance to go early in the day and have a little bit to yourself. It's really, really wonderful. And they, the garden's done a really wonderful job managing that forest. Inwood Hill Park, especially in the Clove, is another place that I really enjoy. Pelham Bay Park, I live on City Island, so it's not hard for me to get out to Hunter Island or Twin Islands and the islands around there. Also really wonderful kayaking out that way. And then, some of the places on Staten Island, like in the Greenbelt, where you feel, you can get, it feels like a long way away from the city in the Greenbelt. And it's such a sort of extraordinary experience in the city to be able to do that.
And I think we have time for one more question, which I guess is, see, have there been any unsolved historical ecological tidbits or mysteries that have eluded you? Like, what's something that jumps out in your mind as something you'd really like to figure out?
Well, I am constantly solving little tiny conundrums. The thing is, sometimes you'll see you'll see a feature, or you'll see something on a map, and you're like, I'm sure there's got to be more about this. And then you dig, and almost always you find something. Like I mentioned, I've been writing about Bay Ridge a little bit, and the Borough Park wetlands. There are a whole series of wetlands in Borough Park once upon a time, and there's a U.S. coastal T-sheet, topographic sheet from 1856 that shows them. And I was like, I'm sure these things had names. And sure enough, Sergei Kandinsky, who might be on the call tonight, he had found a reference to an article that was in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, and I eventually found that, and then that guy had referenced another article, and in the late 19th, early 20th century, all the kids were running around in those woods and going ice skating, and they had names for all of them. So that kind of thing, I really love. Although now I also kind of sigh now when that happens, because then I have another 20 places I have to write about. So.
Wow. Well, thank you. I think it's about time we wrap up, but thank you so much for that, for joining us tonight. Thank you for all the work you've already done and all the work that you're going to be doing on this. I'm really excited to see it all. And it's really great to see that kind of recreating the city that we all walk through. And I'm excited to kind of go out through the city and look at it through your eyes. And try to see what was there and what can be there.
Well, Dustin, thank for all that you do to help the birds in New York City and to create more space for them. I think everybody here appreciates all the amazing work that Audubon does, both in the natural areas, but also with green roofs and green infrastructure to try and make those things more compatible with birds, and to make it a safer city too, with less glass to run into, right?
Yeah.
So
it's an exciting time to think about what we can do to help protect birds in the city and move them forward. And we could all kind of coexist. As you said, we're all New Yorkers, or whatever the name should be.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So I hope everyone had a really good time tonight. I hope you've been inspired, as I have been, to kind of consider the land on which we live, both the historic state, the current state, and also the future. If you're inspired and you'd like to go out and see some of the natural world, so visit some of the sites that Eric had mentioned, we offer hundreds of bird outings annually with New York City Audubon. They are throughout the entire city, and you can visit many of these spots, which Rosalind is currently dropping the link of bird outings and classes that we offer in the chat. Also, if you've enjoyed this evening's lecture, consider joining us on February 6th for a lecture from Yamina Otero and on urban green spaces and the importance for birds and other wildlife. Rosalind is also dropping a link for that upcoming lecture in the chat. So thank you all again. Thank you, Dr. Sanderson, for joining us. Have a good evening, and I look forward to seeing many of you as we're out exploring the city's habitats. Thank you so much.